me introduce to you Octavius Pinkard, who is a PhD researcher at the University of Kent in Canterbury, where his work focuses on the development and projection of identities and interests among Lebanese diaspora communities in Senegal, the United States, and the European Union. He is originally from Danville, Virginia, and has lived in Brussels for the past 3 years. I present to you Octavius Pinkard.
Thank you very much. My focus is mostly on a particular diaspora community, the Lebanese diaspora communities spread quite broadly. And so securitization and diasporas, that hasn't been a topic that's at the core of my interest or my research. It was only 2 years ago that I began to examine it as part of the university's, a 2-year program that the university started with its Conflict Analysis Research Center. And in that program, we brought together not just scholars of security studies or diaspora studies, but also, I think very importantly, we brought together policymakers and members of the NGO community who had been working on the ground with migrant and immigrant communities at the grassroots level to sort of bridge the gap between populations and official institutions. And in some contexts, that's very necessary. It's quite necessary because of levels of trust that exist or don't exist between migrant communities and state institutions. And so these NGOs play a vital role. And so we brought all of them together. Sometimes we tend to have one-dimensional perspective on critical issues. So we might think only about the perspectives of, say, state interests, or of migrant, immigrant community interests, or maybe even of NGO organizations and their interests. But we brought them all together so that they could discuss, so that we could discuss the challenges that they all face and how the securitization process affects each of them. And so we had 2 workshops in Brussels, one in Canterbury, and as a result of these activities, we produced a working paper series, a series of articles, and a policy manual that I was fortunate enough to edit for the program. And so that served as a point of departure for me in examining securitization and diasporas. So that's sort of how I want to introduce that. But I actually want to start substantively by talking about migration, because there can't be a diaspora without migration. There's no immigrant community, no migrant community without migration. And I think that it's a topic that's too easily overlooked in many circles, both in terms of policy and in terms of the scholars, in terms of the academy. I don't know if it's because it's just not a sexy enough topic. It doesn't generate the kind of interest that you see, or sensationalized coverage that you tend to see in various media outlets. But I think migrations are among the most critical of the global issues affecting the international community. And so I think we can see that both in terms of policy, in terms of the academy, the movement, the settlement, and especially the cross-border activities of migrant and immigrant communities matter. And you can see that the implications of those are quite pronounced. There are a number of reasons why individuals and groups might choose to move from one place to the other. In many instances, it's voluntary. It's a wholly voluntary enterprise. You move because you want to enhance your standard of living in order to support yourself and family, or because you also want to support extended family who remain in the home country or the home region. Others, of course, are compelled to move or to leave for reasons related to religious persecution, political persecution, ethnic persecution, natural disaster, or even war, as we see with the refugee crisis taking place now in Europe. But regardless of the motivations for moving, as I mentioned earlier, migration matters. And I think that we have to keep in mind that there are so many pushes and pulls on the psyches of those who migrate. And this will be something that comes into play later as we discuss the diasporas. At once, migrants find themselves struggling with questions of identity and belonging, while they're simultaneously trying to navigate the waters of having to adjust to living in new social and cultural environments. And then you also have an instance in which migrants are securitized by host societies, which question their motivations, they question their allegiance to the state, They question the extent to which they want to become stakeholders in the societies where they've settled. And so there are major questions with which they have to deal, in addition to having just arrived and having to adjust to all of this newness. We also see it to be the case that migrants are instrumentalized by some host governments in the sense that they make use of diaspora communities in order to develop a better understanding of geopolitical realities on the ground in the countries of origin. And so you have these pushes, these pulls, as I mentioned earlier. You have one set of individuals who say, don't come or get out. You have another set in the home country, particularly the state, that says, please go, because they rely on the remittances that they send and the direct investment they can send as a result of working abroad. And so there are lots of different dynamics at play and pull on the psyches of those who migrate. Now, when does migration lead to diasporas, and what distinguishes diaspora communities from just ordinary migrant communities? That's a very important question to ask, so I'm glad you asked. I'm going to tell you what the difference is. Within the study of diasporas, there's a great deal of disagreement about what actually constitutes a diaspora, and whether it's more psychological, whether it's more territorial, whether it's political. And there many different studies have been conducted, but I will only focus on two strands of research. In 1991, Bill Safran published an article in the inaugural issue of the journal Diaspora, in which he provided what became the gold standard as a conceptualization of diasporas. And he conceived of diasporas then as migrant communities that, on the one hand, were dispersed to at least two locations, and then on the other hand, had this mythical image of the homeland. And on the, well, I guess you only have two hands, so I should say additionally, he viewed them as having a strong desire to return to the homeland. And then fourthly, they maintained a connection to the homeland. And then fifthly, and importantly, they were very skeptical, very pessimistic about acceptance in the host society, about belonging to the host society, about being welcomed in the host society. And for him, the Jewish communities epitomized this model better than any. And other scholars built on that definition, that conceptualization of diaspora, and used that as their point of departure for their future studies. And that's, I think, quite nice.
I think it's an interesting explanation you gave her, that definition, because the one group that I know that calls themselves officially a diaspora, the Macedonians, don't really fit that bill.
Yeah, I mean,
There's several characteristics of it that just are not part of their thinking.
I know it's very interesting because sometimes groups are diasporatized, which means that third parties say you are a diaspora, and then some assign themselves diaspora status. And they can pick and choose because there's so many different conceptualizations of what being a diaspora means. For some, being in diaspora means you sort of qualify based on what Safran outlined. For some, it means that you mobilize politically, you engage politically, which is part of the Butler's definition that I'll share in a moment. But there are many different sort of manifestations of those perspectives in scholarship, and I'm part of people who might say that they're part of diaspora. But
is there a numerical threshold for something that can be called a diaspora?
no, there isn't.
Because about a year and a half ago, when the Yazidi crisis broke out, we looked for the Yazidi diaspora in Toronto, and we found him.
Him, yes. So I mean, it's a good question in terms of numbers, all right? When are you a diaspora? I mean, and what's the point of, what would it mean if you're a part of diaspora? Does it mean that state policy will change relative to your 8 people or your 2,400 people? What are the implications of that? I mean, even in France, for instance, where you have rather pronounced diaspora communities, it really hasn't done much in terms of affecting state policy in some contexts. I can talk more about this later, and I will. Because even in the census, the French don't really ask questions about religious identity, right? It's something that's against their ideals, the Republican ideals. And so you can't say, well, you have this. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'm going to talk about sort of the securitization of Muslim diasporas later. But the numbers, I'm not sure the numbers matter so much in terms of what the implications would be for state policy. What matters most is the extent to which those who are part of the diaspora, whether it's 8, 10, 20, 1.2 million, the extent to which they perhaps may pose a threat to the states in which they've settled, the extent to which they integrate learning the language, participating in, I hate to say the host society, but the majority community in the countries in which they settle. But in any event, you have this conception of diasporas that includes a very important transnational dimension. This is why I really like the Butler definition of diaspora. And when we think about transnationalism in this context, we're talking about, so many things. This is not exhaustive, but voting, of course. Many migrants and members of diaspora communities vote in their home countries. Not all can do that, but many of them do. Lebanese diaspora cannot. We'll talk about that later if you like. There are political implications, political reasons why that's the case. Voting, sending remittances, supporting insurgent groups in some instances in the country or region of origin. That's very important in terms of securitization. But transnationalism has become much easier for diaspora communities because of advances in technology and diffusion of that advanced technology to many different places. So diaspora communities can do more and do it faster and much easier than has ever been the case before. And so this facilitates their cross-border activities. Now, where does securitization come into play? With diasporas and transnational activity. And what do we mean by securitization? Obviously and intuitively, by securitization we mean that the diaspora communities have been identified as communities that pose a threat to the physical security of the state, potential terrorist activity, but also perhaps to human security in terms of food security. If resources are scarce, you have communities moving in, this is a threat to our food security and other dimensions of human security. And when we think about migration, people don't just move themselves, their bodies, they can bring things with them, right? Like disease, so that's also a concern for health and security. So yes, when we think about securitization, we mean that diaspora communities have been identified as threats to physical security, to other dimensions of security. But importantly, this is often overlooked, securitization means that particular diaspora communities have been moved from being national concerns to being transnational concerns, which is to say that a particular community, and in the European context we're speaking about diaspora communities that have originated, or whose origins are in Muslim majority countries, these communities have been identified as threats for multiple states. So it's not just a national concern, it becomes a regional concern, or becomes a transnational concern in the sense that it's not just Europe, it's Europe, North Africa, it's Europe, and perhaps even North America, because of the linkages that exist and have been expanded and enhanced as a result of globalization. So securitization, yes, you've been identified as a threat, but then secondly, and importantly, these communities have been moved from categories based on ethnic or religious, national origin as national issues to transnational issues for multiple states. And also, communities have been securitized in the sense that their threat has served as an integrating reality, an integrating dynamic for multiple states. Right? And so why have these diaspora communities in Europe, particularly the Muslim communities that have origins from Muslim majority states, why have they been securitized? Now, in one of the chapters that I'm writing, I focus on event-triggered sectarian identity projection. So how do events lead members of the Lebanese diaspora to project their identity as being Shia, focus on the Shia in particular in this context? Events matter. And so in that context, I'm looking at, for instance, the death of Hafez al-Assad of Syria in 2000, the assassination of former Prime Minister Rafik Hariri in 2005, and the war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006. that generated a great deal of change in the willingness of members of the Shia community in various countries to publicly demonstrate that they were Shia. So events matter. Events also matter for policymakers, not just for members of the diaspora. And so policymakers use events sometimes as catalysts. They view events as catalysts for framing how they view threats, but also how they view appropriate policy responses to these perceived threats. And so if we look in the European context, we can think, for instance, in July in the summer of '95, shortly after Chirac took office in France, there were bombings at the Paris metro. This demonstrated that, to some extent, the borders weren't as limiting as they once were in preventing the movement of people who might desire to do harm to populations. In March of 2004, there were the Madrid train bombings. You had 200 people killed and 9 times as many who were injured. In 2005, you had the attacks on the public transport system in London, where you had scores injured, many were killed. In October 2011, you had another attack on the Paris public transportation system. Only 4 were killed in this instance, but one is too many, obviously. In October of, the summer of last year, there was the attack in the Jewish Museum of Belgium, in which 4 people were killed in Brussels. In January of this year, of course, you had the Charlie Hebdo attacks, in which 12 people were killed. And just 2 days ago, the Spanish authorities moved in to disrupt what they identified as a terrorist cell that was planning an imminent attack of the Charlie Hebdo variety. Now, the common thread among these events that I just noted is that the perpetrators were predominantly individuals who were born in Europe within diaspora communities, or they moved to Europe and settled in Europe. We'll have, just a couple of months ago, there was Ayoub Al-Kazani, born in Morocco, who boarded the train from Amsterdam to Paris. He boarded in Brussels, and his attack was thwarted by a British tourist and 3 American tourists. He fits this I won't say profile, this mold as well. This reinforces, for some policymakers, the threat posed by those who come from diaspora communities. It also reinforces in the psyche of members of society, some members of society, that these individuals, these groups of individuals, pose a threat to our survival, to our security, etc. And so it is in this context then that we shouldn't be surprised that Muslim diaspora communities have been securitized to the extent that they've been securitized in Europe. Now, what are the implications of this securitization of these communities? I'll think about this in 2 ways. One, what are the implications for the diaspora communities themselves? And what are the implications for the state? And then I'll save more for discussion. There's a lot more to be said, but I don't want this to become a lecture. I want to sort of have some robust discussion. So what are the implications for diaspora communities? In some senses, securitization has led to further alienation of those members of the diaspora communities, particularly 2nd and 3rd generation, but especially 3rd generation migrants, who already feel as though they don't belong, who already feel as though they've been marginalized within society. And it could be the case that, and you have to keep in mind that these are the individuals who are more likely to travel to Iraq or to Syria as foreign fighters, and then return further radicalized. They're also more likely to be individuals who would carry out the kinds of attacks that I just outlined, that I just delineated. And these are indiscriminate acts of violence. They were born in these countries or grew up in these countries, so the attacks that they carry out could well kill people with whom they went to school, people with whom they grew up. This is indiscriminate violence. The sense of alienation, the strong feelings of being distant from society, the anger is so strong that they're willing to engage in this kind of activity. And so it could be the case, I'm saying that it is, but it could be the case that securitization further alienates these individuals and could drive them to alternative structures of representation. Who speaks for me? Who speaks for my community? And so they may turn to alternative structures of representation, but also to alternative structures of belonging. And this is where they can fall prey to the rhetoric of groups such as Daesh, ISIS, or the rhetoric of more radical individuals or groups of individuals within Europe. Another implication of securitization is one that we might identify for states themselves, because it could lead to cycles of insecurity. The further you engage in the securitization process and push individuals toward radicalization indirectly, the more insecure your state may become. But in defense of states, in defense of European states and others who engage in the securitization, I have to say that one element of securitization has been sort of ignored in the discourses by NGOs and others. And is that you're not just recognizing groups as potential threats to your state's security, but you're also, as part of securitization, trying to understand why they become radicalized and how they become radicalized in an effort to craft policies that prevent that. And so this is one of the many discussions that were held with the NGO, state, and diaspora communities that we had in the working paper series and in that program. So what I'll do is I'll pause there, and because there's a lot more to be said, but I want to save a bit more for discussion, particularly, for instance, whether diasporas import conflict. Right? This is something that's very important to determine whether they do, to what extent they do, what causes that, and others. So I'll pause there, and then we can engage in discussion about some of the further implications here.
Where is the majority of the violence? Where does the trigger come from? Like, does it come within communities and community leaders, such as priests or imams or tribal elders, or is it the diaspora young, kind of looking abroad and looking on radicalized websites or looking, at the news and kind of coming to their own conclusions?
Yeah, I mean, this is very interesting, very good question, obviously. Those who feel marginalized, who feel alienated, as I mentioned, they turn to these alternative structures of belonging, these alternative structures of representation. And for some, that might be more radical imams who are preaching hatred. And this is important because this is what they've experienced, this is what they see. And they look at the securitization of their communities as being proof, in some measure, of the extent to which they don't belong in those societies. But also, as I mentioned earlier, the diffusion of technology has made it much easier. You don't have to have radical imams within European capitals or any European cities. You can go online very easily and access speeches, videos, etc., by those who are elsewhere. And so there are many different ways in which people become radicalized. It doesn't necessarily have to be a person-to-person interaction that gives rise to that.
Is there data that exists that kind of points one way or the other? Is there any kind of conclusive conclusion that's been drawn by policymakers or security agencies that it's either internalized within the community or it's, as you say, it's that technology that's opened up a new floodgate or that you don't need as a person-to-person?
But one of the interesting things that we discussed in this program was that the states need to be more active in engaging the first generation of the diaspora communities as those who might be better able of reaching the third generation, the second generation, to prevent radicalization.
Right.
And in this instance, you provide, for instance, resources. And this is where they lean more so on the NGOs than on the state. But the NGOs can provide resources, for instance, for job training, for other programs that would occupy the time of members who might be at risk of being radicalized. So it's not necessarily the case that they feel as though it's inherent. They're somehow prone to radicalization as being part of the diaspora community. I think this is very important. This is a good question because it raises a point that I think is very important. There's a debate on whether diasporas cause conflict in the host and in the host state, and conflicts in the host state. Some, like Collier, would say yes, states with large diaspora populations are more prone to experiencing conflicts. Whereas others, and I tend to agree with this second perspective, advocated, for instance, by Francesco Ragazzi, who's a scholar at Leiden University, diasporas themselves do not cause conflict or sustain conflict. It's groups and spokespersons who claim to act on behalf of the diaspora that do that. And so the key for policymakers is to focus on specific political organizations and not on whole diaspora communities in terms of their securitization. So no necessarily internalized. Not only are there different definitions and conceptions of diaspora, but it's not the case that those who might be part of a diaspora community say that they're part of a diaspora. All right? So you can be diasporatized by third parties. All right? So Jonas can say that he's part of the German diaspora in Canada, and then scholars would say, no, you're not. All right? Or others can say that you are part of the German diaspora because they want to use you for a number count for various purposes. So there are different motivations for using the term or not using the term. Some are political, some are economic. I mean, it just varies depending on.
On the question that do diasporas cause conflict, do you give any credence or weight to the kind of Huntington-esque argument that based on cultural or religious or traditional differences in practices about how cultures develop along different lines, there are certain diasporas, not all of them, but some that do cause conflict within states?
No.
No, you don't.
So I think Huntington is as wrong on that as Collier is on those other issues. Huntington does great work. I mean, I cannot criticize him. This is a leading scholar of international relations, and he's done great work broadly on international relations, and some really interesting work on French politics too. But I think he's wrong on this because
He's wrong on a lot of things.
yes, absolutely.
Everyone's wrong on a lot of things.
He's really wrong on that.
There is as much variation within particular communities, and as many tensions that exist within particular communities, for instance, diaspora communities, then there are tensions or fissures that exist between those communities and the West, right, or the host society. And so I don't think I think it was a bit oversimplified for him to say. First, I don't agree with the class of civilizations argument at all. I think I don't agree with this. I don't think it applies in the diaspora context either. Because, for instance, with the Lebanese diaspora, you have each group has its own set of interests. So, for instance, the Shia, the Sunni, and the Maronite Christians who are in the United States, they all lobby. They all lobby for different things, completely different things. And so you can't say, well, the Lebanese diaspora in the United States is at odds with, you have to disaggregate these communities to examine and then to appreciate the distinctions that exist and the tensions that might exist within those communities. And they don't always play out in the diaspora, but sometimes they do. I mean, in many instances, the conflicts that exist within home states are reproduced in the diaspora. That's very often the case. They bring the conflict with them. But not always. I mean, I'm finding with the Lebanese, for instance, that that's not the case, which I think is really fascinating. They do still lobby for different things because, especially related to foreign policy in Syria and things like that, and states are more or less receptive, depending on which states they are, based on their interests. But
You mentioned the importance of events, and I think I can give you a very good example of how events change behavior or even perceptions of themselves. All during Soviet time, there was a significant community here of what we would call Yugoslavian origin that all got along reasonably well together. And in fact, there were two members of provincial parliament who represented contiguous ridings, and one was Serbian of background, and the other one was Kosovar background. But nobody knew that. They were together, they had been elected and re-elected several times, and they sat amicably beside each other in the house until the conflict in Serbia, between Serbia and Kosovo, broke out, and then all of a sudden they couldn't be friends anymore, and they couldn't get along with each other anymore. And it became a bit of a kerfuffle. As a matter of fact, one of them asked the speaker to be assigned, if he could be assigned to a different seat in the House. It was that, but that had never occurred before. And people did not identify at that point, before that, with a particular movement there. But the event in the homeland suddenly brought out this...
Events have transformative power.
Yeah.
The Lebanese Shia in Senegal, for instance, were quite dormant in their sort of Shia identity. They were Lebanese, which nobody really expected in terms of how you settle, you bring your identity with you. To what extent does sectarianism travel in the diaspora? It does in that context, which was really surprising for me. The tensions that exist are actually surprisingly between those who have been there for some time and the new arrivals from Lebanon.
That's what
it had nothing to do with sectarianism. There were even Maronite priests who were conducting wedding ceremonies for Shia or Sunni. It was amazing. But events do have transformative power, particularly for those in the diaspora, because you may not have had. There may have been an attachment, as you said, this mythical connection to the homeland, and events can ignite that or reignite it for some segments of those communities.
So within diasporas in your study, do you have a lot of emphasis on kind of the connections that they have with each other? For instance, like I lived in Saudi Arabia for a long time, and there was huge Lebanese population there. But they all knew each other. Like all of their dads had gone to school with each other. Or is that something you take into account when you're looking at diasporas and kind of defining them? Is this connection not only in the homeland, but also when they migrate, they kind of migrate together, or like I migrate to the U.S. because you're there and I knew you from school or something like that?
Yeah, it's all part of the networks
Right.
that have been established, and others from the community follow those networks because these are where the opportunities may avail themselves, may make themselves available. You also have to be the case with the Lebanese diaspora and other diasporas too, but quite a bit in this case that people from one village tend to migrate to one particular
That's how it works.
place. I conducted interviews this summer, and then last year I was there for 4 months. And when I interviewed, so are you going to go to Dubai? Are you going to go to, because if you are, my cousin is there.
Yeah.
Really let me show you around, things for you. Or if you go to Saudi Arabia, or if you go to Senegal, so you tend to see it to be quite common. That from sort of villages are replicated, so the families move, their children, their grandchildren move to particular areas. Okay.
So going back to what you were talking about, sometimes generations of diasporas can get alienated in their host country. So here, like when the Sri Lankan Civil War broke out, you have all these people here who started protesting about what was happening in Sri Lanka and what the Sri Lankan government was doing and things like that. So, and then the fact that the Canadian government didn't quite respond the way that they wanted them to, would you say that also sort of alienates the generations of Sri Lankans or Tamils or whoever is in the host country, creating more tension? Like, what is your take on that? How does a host country sort of respond to something? On that sort of level.
For those who believe that in order to be part of diaspora, you have to mobilize around different issues, politically, whatever. Okay, so they are diaspora because they're mobilizing, organizing politically. And I mean, they're making demands just like any diaspora group would, in response to what's taking place in the country of origin or the region of origin. I think it's in some instances, diaspora communities have heightened senses of, I don't want to use the word relevance.
Absolutely.
But heightened senses of significance to the host governments, or the governments in the countries of settlement, thinking that the government is going to respond if they mobilize. Of course, that's not always the case. I'll go back to the Shia and Maronite lobbying in the United States. They don't lobby for the same issues in terms of foreign policy, especially as it relates to Syria. And so the Shia would advocate the Maronites would advocate for a hard line against Assad. And so they would say that, the United States has followed these policies because we've been lobbying very effectively. executive branch, legislature, we've lobbied very effectively. Not really, but this is their perception. Because what they're asking for in their lobbying is exactly the same. It's a parallel to what the Israeli lobby is advocating in terms of U.S. policy towards Syria. So it's not necessarily the case that the Maronites in the United States are very effective in their lobbying. It's just that what they want is consistent with what a more entrenched and more effective lobbying organization has been advocating. I do think, as I mentioned earlier, that some groups think they're perhaps more relevant than they are. But I think that using official channels to try to influence policy is a good thing for diaspora organizations. Because in that sense, you may not be identified as groups that you sort of operate on the margins, on the edges, I should say. You're using those official channels, legitimate channels, to influence policy. And so that, over time, could help to build. And if the numbers increase, and if other interests become more compelling, that can make it.
So going back to the original 4 points that you said that you that form part of kind of the main creed of diaspora politics, you mentioned, I don't know if you used the word mistrust or have difficulty integrating into the host society on the part of the population. How do you specifically define that? I mean, I'm assuming that it's kind of contextual based on one experience versus the other, but kind of if you can maybe, like, what are the main factors or markers that you look for to be able to isolate the fact that they don't integrate or have trouble or are distrustful?
Right. When Saffron said that, he was saying that there was this sense of pessimism about belonging, about acceptance by the host society. And I think part of that could be born of course it's different than we are, part of that could be born of, especially for second generation, maybe, third generation, and also depending on the age of first generation migrant community, migrants who come to the country. It could be an issue of not learning the language, which could affect the extent to which you're embraced, you're accepted. It could be the extent to which you participated, and this is a thing that we see quite frequently in Belgium. You have a large diaspora community from the Congo, and they have essentially integrated in Belgium in terms of speaking the language, which wasn't difficult because they already spoke French, most of them. But in terms of being part of Belgian society, not just Walloon society, but Belgian society, this has been a successful integration. But there are other communities within Belgium, more recently arrived communities, that come to join diasporas that are already there from their countries of origin, that haven't integrated so well, that haven't taken the time to learn one of the three languages, because also German, so it's French, Dutch, and German, and who sort of they self-isolate themselves, and then they wonder why, the view is that they don't belong, or they don't feel as though they're going to be accepted. And then this plays into the rhetoric that's promoted by various political parties in Belgium, but also in France with the Front National, but in Belgium with the NVA or Vlaams Belang, anti-immigrant parties who point to this as saying, well, you see, I told you so. And this also is affecting state responses to the refugee crisis. For people who come from particular countries, say, look, the ones who are already here aren't integrating, so what do you think is going to happen? Because obviously as a refugee, the implication is that you're going to return to your country of origin when the conditions that force you to leave no longer exist. I don't think anybody believes that Syrian refugees are going back next week, or 2 months from now, or even next year. And so the question is, okay, how integrated do they want to become once they come here? So language, self-isolation, not attending school, because this is also, truancy is a major problem also with some of the newer arrivals. And so engaging in criminal activity, I don't want to sound so negative, but these are some of the things that present themselves as realities in this context. But he was saying that it's pessimism about whether they'll be accepted. Maybe because of previous experiences with that host government, with his country, or with his people, or because it might be the case that you feel like my ideology, my worldview is incompatible with the status quo in this host society. That could also be the case.
Yesterday when we were talking about foreign fighters that go back to Syria and Iraq. You mentioned how Denmark actually has a rehabilitation program that they've set for fighters that come back. I wanted to know your take on it and if you think it's successful.
I think it's one of the most innovative approaches to the foreign fighter phenomenon that I've seen. Well, not that I've been there to witness the program, but it's it's quite similar. They've sort of taken the post-conflict DDR sort of disarmament, demobilization, rehabilitation model and employed it relative to foreign fighters. So individuals go to Syria, Iraq, wherever, to fight with ISIS. And you also have to keep this in mind, because this isn't promoted so much. There are also foreign fighters who go to fight for Assad, to fight for the regime against Daesh. And that's I think, something that, I think there's a study to be done on that. I don't have time to do it.
Do you have any numbers on that?
No, I don't say that. That's what I'm saying. There's a study to be done, because I think it's very interesting.